call your names and
Sure.
titles and where you're from?
We'll do a quick round. My name is Sam Liccardo. I'm the mayor of the city of San Jose, California.
Eric Adams, Brooklyn Ball president.
Akila Sherrills, Community-Based Public Safety Collective.
CJ Davis, Chief of Police, City of Memphis, Tennessee.
And I'm David Brown, Police Superintendent of the City of Chicago.
Robert Tracy, Chief of Wilmington Police, Delaware.
So how was the meeting, and what did you glean from the meeting that's the most important issue?
Well, I'll just jump in quickly. It was a very robust meeting. The president is genuinely engaged with local communities, trying to understand what's happening on the ground and looking proactively for partnerships that will enable us all to reduce gun violence in our own communities. He has laid out a very extensive plan. It's clear that the creative leaders you see standing around me have been leading innovative efforts to tackle violence in their own communities, and he is looking for those ideas that he can then scale throughout the country as he continues to push forward.
Mr. Adams, could I ask you two questions from the New York Post? As a former Republican during Mayor Giuliani's reign, are there any positive lessons on combating crime from his era that you like? And also, if I could ask a second question, are you going to be making sure that there are more NYPD officers hired and that they're paid more as President Biden proposes?
Well, okay, first I want to touch on that I will hope every American will just hear from these men and women who I am here with right now. Oftentimes you think about policing that there's a conflict between those who wear the uniform, these amazing innovators around violence, the diversity, having a woman that heads a police department, as I see, is important. The meeting before the meeting was extremely productive. We had a great conversation, and the information sharing must be between these great men and women who are behind me. The question is, as we mentioned in the meeting today, we spent too much time looking at the role the police play. And as a former police officer, as a former, as you say, Republican, as a current Democrat, as a former person who was arrested and beat by police officers, I'm so many formers, I'm trying to figure out the current. One thing I'm clear about, the prerequisite to prosperity is public safety and justice. And if we don't have them both together, it doesn't matter how many police officers you put on the streets. We can't continue to respond to symptoms. It's time to respond to the underlying causes of violence in our city. This president is making it clear he's going to redefine the ecosystem of public safety, and that includes identifying the role of police, schools, families, resources, employment. This is where we need to go as a country. And I have to take my hat off to this president. Why did it take so long before we heard the gunshots that families were listening and hearing every night? Other communities were waking up to alarm clocks. Communities of black, brown, and poor people are waking up to gunshots. And this president said, this is not the America we're going to live in. And that is why I'm here. And I'm so proud to have been part of this meeting. And I'm proud of these men and women who are here today, because this is representative of what makes us great as a country.
Tomorrow, the president, I have a question for you for tomorrow. The president will be speaking in Philadelphia on voting rights. And he says that he'll be coming from the perspective of morals. Do you believe on policing that it is a moral or more so a legislative issue?
Combination. I believe that change is about those who agitate, such as the marches, negotiate, and legislate. And the real legislative response should be to the moral response. We've abandoned black and brown and poor communities in this country. We responded immediately when we saw those shooters with assault rifles that hit our college campuses in suburban counties, and it was the right thing to do. But the problem in America is the handgun. Yet the demographics of the victims are black, brown, and poor. we have ignored it for far too long. And we continue to have institutions in place and practices that feed crime in our country. How do we have a prison system where 30% of the people, the inmates, are dyslexic? That means the real crime didn't take place only on the streets. It took place in the Department of Education across America that refuses to identify how we feed crime. And so I think it's a moral and a legislative response to this, and we have a president that understands the moral responsibility.
Are you going to hire more cops, though, as
You stay in New York, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what you told President Biden about New York specifically. What did you make any requests or demands or?
Yes. I'm here representing the great city of New York, and I'm clear on that. I'm not representing the country. I came here as the Brooklyn Borough president, which can be considered the third largest city in America. I think that my request of the president was, number one, to make sure that we use the money that is being allocated to deal with underlying causes, because we must have a plan that's prevention and intervention. Prevention consists of some of the long-term things I'm talking about: dyslexia screening, doulas, making sure we have job employment, which he's doing in his plan, and then intervention. We need to put in place real plans in New York City to go after the gun violence. We had a 13-year-old child that was assassinated in the Bronx, a 10-year-old child that was shot in Rockaway. These parents and families are looking for real relief right now, and I think there's some things we can do with the dollars that the president has allocated to make sure we get to those long-term plans. And does it mean, do we need to hire more police officers that are being asked over and over again? No, it means using the dollars correctly. And if that means putting more police in our subway system, let's do that. If that means putting more police officers out of their vehicles and walk the streets and have greater community engagement, let's do that. That means do whatever needs to be done to make the people of New York City safe.
Police chiefs, any of the police chiefs, how do you guys marry the crime prevention initiative by the president as well as the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act?
Well, I'm Chief Davis from the city of Memphis, and I come from a city that is experiencing gun violence disproportionately in black and brown communities. There has to be a correlation between the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and also the work and the plan and the strategic plan that this president is pushing forward. We have to find balance. We can't continue to arrest crime away. We need to get guns off the street, hold people accountable, and ensure that our communities get the kind of protection that they need. Right now, black and brown communities are being terrorized from gun violence. We need to ensure that we give people an opportunity to stay out of the criminal justice system, but those individuals who continue to commit violent crime, they need to be dealt with by the criminal justice system. So we have to have balance.
Superintendent Brown, Lynn Sweet from the Chicago Sun-Times.
Yes.
Did you get any sense in the meeting about when the strike force will arrive in Chicago and what exactly is the makeup of it, what it's going to do? Will it arrive sooner than a month?
So one of the things we talked about, and I'm David Brown, Superintendent of Police, Chicago Police Department. One of the things we discussed was this sense of urgency around violence, the things we can do in the near term now. The strike force being one of the things we can start doing now. We haven't waited for that collaboration with the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, inside Chicago and other parts of the country. We've started putting together these plans. Likely we'll be rolling out something in the coming days so that we can start the investigative process both on tracing guns, but focused on gun trafficking. That's the impact. Making consequences happen in the federal courts. We did talk about the whole of government approach, the ecosystem of public safety that also includes street outreach, violence interruption, but we really focused on near-term, making serious consequences a thing that happens in our cities with gun trafficking. Those who create violence in our cities that's happening right now. There was a sense of urgency both from the president and his administration. Both the Attorney General Garland was talking about a sense of urgency. What can we do now, adding resources now to have an impact on violence in our cities?
Because Garland is from the area, grew up in Lincolnwood, did he say anything to you that showed he knew the very areas that are troublesome in Chicago? And
Yes, Attorney General Garland and I had a conversation before the meeting started. We had some commitments from him to help out with Chicago, and he offered whatever we needed from DOJ, we would get those resources.
So
It includes task force officers. It includes additional prosecutions. It includes fast-tracking investigations on conspiracy cases. These are the people that drive violence in our cities. And so there was a significant commitment. It wasn't just a bland, great thing that you didn't, it was very substantive.
so is this to redeploy people who are on the ground already, or to send in extra people?
It's both. It's deploying more resources as well as a hyper-focus on people who drive violence in our cities.
So is this a one-on-one pull-aside you had with Garland?
Yes, this was prior to the meeting. He and I talked, and we discussed it during the meeting, and we'll have significant follow-up following the meeting.
Okay, so you, Mr. Adams talked about a pre-meeting. Who was at the pre-meeting? Who was there?
We all of us was at the pre-meeting,
Okay,
so we
who
all had
did you
just
meet?
kind of
Who was-
informal conversations with amongst the group,
just
everyone in the
among you
group.
all.
Yeah, and I think others want to ask
Why not?
questions. You've done like 5 in a row.
During the meeting with President Biden, did he express a concern about gun violence and crime being worse in the weeks to come?
He expressed a concern regarding a sense of urgency to do something now, and not just to discuss the problem, but to find solutions that we all could bring to the table that we could do almost immediately. And one of the things was a strike force, but additional resources from DOJ, from the Attorney General's office was discussed. A real commitment to follow up after today's meeting with significant things we all can do now. We did talk about long-term impacts, things that happen that speaks to the root causes of violent crime, but we had significant discussions around what we can do now. I want to just give some time to this gentleman who is part of the ecosystem of criminal justice that impacts the things that calm down the community, that creates peace treaties in the community with people who will commit crime. Please.
Yes, sir. I know that traditionally we say, traditionally you say public safety and people say police. And as my colleague said, that, there's an ecosystem of public safety that we actually have to fund. For far too long, we've invested heavily in law enforcement as a single, kind of ubiquitous point of safety, in our community, and we haven't invested in community-based solutions. So I represent an agency, the Community-Based Public Safety Collective, that is agencies who have been for close to 30 years doing community-based public safety initiatives like Cure Violence, like Advance Peace, like the National Network of Safe Communities, who have evidence-based results as well as community support in terms of their complementary strategy to reduce violence and crime in urban cities across the country. So the CBI initiative is unprecedented because we've seen violence spike, during the summertime in urban communities for close to 30 years. And so this president, this administration is launching an immediate, strategy to address violence on the ground now. This strategic partnership with community-based violence intervention, philanthropy, law enforcement to address immediate violence, as well as lay the foundation for a longer-term strategy. Someone talked about the George Floyd Act or the Breaking Cycle of Violence Act. Those are also really important initiatives that put more dollars and resources into relationship-based strategies on the ground. Because again, we can't have just we can't have public safety without the public.
Can you give us
Initially.
an example of what that looks like? What are you doing currently, like an actual example?
Yes.
I know the president said he's interested in getting, I'm paraphrasing, pay into people's pockets instead of
Yes.
them pulling pistols out.
That's
Are
right.
you talking, is what your work is in line with what he was saying and describe
Yes.
something specifically so that our listeners and viewers will know what to go looking for?
That's right. So the Newark Community Street Team is the agency that I currently run in the city of Newark. It is a complementary strategy to public safety. We employ about 50 residents from the neighborhood. 100% of our staff are residents of the communities in which they live in. And we train them in conflict resolution, mediation, de-escalation strategies, trauma-informed approaches, and we deploy them at 3 key intersections. We have a high-risk intervention team that intervenes in individual and group conflicts, both historical and present. We have a team that does safe passage around our schools. We did a study with the health department and discovered that most of the violence that's happening in the neighborhood is happening in and around schools. Things happen on the campus during the week and spill into the community on the weekend and vice versa, right? So our high-risk interventionists, non-traditional leaders, ex-gang members, ex-convicts, people who have changed their lives for the positive, act as a deterrent at these schools and prevent violence, right? We also have victims advocates. It's interesting that black and brown folks in many of these communities that experience high levels of violence don't identify as victims. victims have a negative connotation to it. So we call ourselves survivors, right? And the survivor says that someone has had an experience, they're engaged in their respective healing journey, and conceivably they don't want it to happen to others, right? And so this kind of coordinated services strategy amongst residents and community, we also launched the city's first hospital-based violence intervention program, right? So when people are harmed, they go to the hospital, we meet them bedside, we consent them into the program. Our high-risk interventionist meets the community health worker to, negotiate a safety plan. Because there's a pretty high threshold in terms of arrest and prosecution, and law enforcement is not always able to make an arrest. So you need residents who are reputable, credible messengers, who are trained on the ground, who can mediate some of these conflicts to a peaceful outcome, while law enforcement gathers the intelligence and the information that they need to make an arrest. And now also we know that the arrest doesn't always end the problem, right? There's a direct correlation between what happens in jail and what happens in the community. So there's a lot of maintenance work that goes into mediation and conflict resolution. It's not just a one-time thing and you get together and it's over, right? And so this is a career path for many folks in our community. It's a workforce development opportunity, because people get paid like doing this work. It's extremely dangerous work. We leverage our relationship capital in neighborhoods in order to prevent, violence from happening. And we work closely with law enforcement. We don't share intelligence with law enforcement because it impacts our credibility and potentially the lives of the individuals who are actually mediating the conflict in the field. But we have a professional understanding, right? We're working on a parallel path around safety and community. We're all headed towards the same mountaintop. And so we respect each other's work in the field. This coordinated strategy, at least in a city like Newark, we've had 5 consecutive years in a row of decrease of a homicide and overall violence. In the South Ward, where violence was concentrated for almost 50 consecutive years, we've had a negative 48% reduction in homicide in these communities. This is because you have a coordinated strategy, with municipal services, with law enforcement, with community-based organization, with health, with schools, all working together to present a comprehensive ecosystem of safety in communities. And this is the thing that we have to invest in and support.
If I could just add 3, I just wanted to add 3. You asked about dollars in pockets, and what the American Rescue dollars will allow us to do in D.C. are many things. We have a $59 million investment that's in front of our council now. I'll just highlight a couple. One is we're actually identify green jobs that these dollars will create at our Department of Public Works. 100 new positions that all of our teams that are working to prevent crime will now be able to connect those individuals looking for a different path to those jobs. We're also going to pilot an initiative for returning citizens. Our DC residents coming home from incarceration with cash assistance. And the last one that I will highlight is a program for housing. If you hear from a lot of people who are looking for a different path, housing is a huge barrier. And sometimes we can make neighborhoods safer if we're able to provide housing in a different neighborhood for a family, an entire family, or someone who is involved in crime.
Mayor Bowser, what about fencing around this building and also from around the Capitol in recent weeks?
Yep.
Are you now more able to focus on street violence in D.C. without worrying about the political violence?
We focus on it all. That's our job. Our Metropolitan Police Department supports our federal law enforcement partners, Secret Service here, United States Capitol Police at the Capitol, and First Amendment demonstrations when they happen in Washington. So that's our job, to focus on everything. It is important, however, that the federal government have a strategy to protect its assets that doesn't involve so much human labor. And so the intelligence focus, looking at how to harden their environment without tall fences is something that we have always called for. And it's just another reminder to everybody listening that DC is open and come and visit us.
Immunity for police officers that are going to be sued. There's an argument that there should be immunity for police officers who are threatened to be sued. What is your thought on that and the broader scale? Certainly,
Sure. Certainly, we have been very focused on a full range of reforms to our criminal justice system. And for our police over the last 20 years, what we've been focusing on is professionalizing and training and holding our police officers accountable, and that will continue to be our strategy.
I realize today's meeting might have focused on operational developments, but is there a sense of urgency here politically to also send a message that local Democratic leaders, are supportive of expanding police forces, especially in the face of criticism from Republicans and other challengers that are seeking to link the defund the police label to Democrats?
Well, I think, I can speak for Washington, D.C. and myself, and my commitment to D.C. residents is to always put in front of them and our council what we need. What we need in terms of new officers. That's why my budget includes 100 new officers, 200 new police cadets. And next year, I actually think we'll be able to do a little bit more. But it also includes violence prevention efforts to the tune of $59 million. And so I think from a city like ours, people care about safety, they care about fair policing and justice, and they care that the police and the community work together. Thank you, everybody.